Good evening, good evening. Well, we're going to start Pellowe Talk very soon, but we've come on early just to help people tune in a little bit. And just as a bit of a pre-show, I'm going to share an article from tonight's distinguished guest, Professor Flint. And the article reads, New South Wales under dictatorship too. And this is part of Professor Flint's weekly show, Take Back Your Country. And he's now done 45 episodes on The Good Source. The latest outburst of the Wuhan virus in New South Wales and extending into other states appears to be the result of the New South Wales government ignoring warnings and leaving limousine drivers for airline crew unregulated. Who paid the consequences? Not the New South Wales Berejiklian government, and certainly not the responsible health minister, Hazzard, who quietly changed the law about limousine drivers with a stroke of the pen after lockdown began without any prior checks or balances. And if we're all in this together, why don't politicians share in the pain and forego all salary over $2,500 a week? Instead, the people of Greater Sydney, which now includes most of New South Wales's population, will pay. And like the East German Stasi, the New South Wales police are, with the Premier's blessing, building up an army of informers. These are not to inform on misbehaving or incompetent politicians, but rather on other citizens who do not follow to the letter the latest laws. One regulation even forbids browsing in shops, so don't check on that fruit before you decide which to buy, and you must go shopping alone. People living in Fairfield but working outside, most of them, have to be tested every 3 days. After a full day's work, many had to queue for over 8 hours on the first night to find the testing station closed. Yet, according to many in the commentariat, the New South Wales Premier was, when it came to dealing with Wuhan, the gold standard. No more. The dreaded QR code is everywhere, despite warnings by respected computer law expert Professor Graham Greenleaf, maybe that's Greenleaf, of its many dangers, including potential identity theft and government abuse. In the meantime, the West Australian dictatorship hints that the border may be closed permanently, contrary to the Constitution, which Canberra shows no interest in enforcing. It is hard to have confidence in a Premier who believes Australians are no good at manufacturing, but then imports ferries which rust and are of a size which will decapitate passengers when they go under bridges, as well as trains too wide to fit into existing tunnels. This is a government which, instead of buying modern trackless trams, bankrupted dozens of businesses, wasted a fortune, and took over 4 years to lay a tram track down George Street. According to ICAC, after 10 years, the government has still not implemented all of its recommendations to protect against the corruption risks involved in lobbying. These should have been in place had two curious operations proceeded until increasing public outrage stopped them. They were the sale of extremely valuable city land on which the Powerhouse Museum stands, following its transfer to flood-prone land at Parramatta, or the expropriation of cemeteries well run by the Catholic Church. And notwithstanding the disaster of privatising compliance with building standards by developers, which resulted in jerry-built home units, the government insisted on privatising land registration. What is most damning is that the Premier presides over schools where neo-Marxists seem free to indoctrinate and abuse children, with standards constantly falling below those of comparable countries. And why does her government's energy policy seem as if it were written by the Greens? Why was abortion law reform never mentioned in the election, presumably to increase abortions and initially proposing just a touch of infanticide in relation to babies who survive, allowed to be a priority issue? But as regards Wuhan, all the evidence shows that large lockdowns on the communist Chinese model do not work and are enormously destructive of businesses, careers, and lives. The last model you would have thought any coalition or indeed Labor government would use. Welcome to Pellowe Talk. Let's get started.
May all that you stand for and that we stand for be preserved under the providence of God for the happiness of mankind.
The trouble is caused by unthinking people who carelessly throw away ageless ideals as if they were old and outworn machinery.
But it is the values of individual liberty, equality before the law, and the supremacy of people over the state to which we can always with confidence return as a powerful and uniting force.
Australia is not a secular country. It is a free country.
Well, good evening and welcome to Pellowe Talk in this very special episode about constitutions and conventions. We are on the brink of the LNP state convention in Queensland, and that happens in the middle of July roughly every year. And this year is no exception. However, this year is a year where the number of attendants is said to be much higher than recent years, which have seen significant dwindling. Numbers have been dwindling for a long time now because the grassroots members are rather bored and feel frustrated by the waste of time it is going. Well, this week, outgoing Member of Parliament, George Christensen, who is serving his last term, basically let loose and said what he really thinks about the party, no longer able to face disendorsement by them for the rest of his career. You thought he was blunt and honest before. Well, now he's well and truly off the leash. So he released a statement, and we published that in a podcast and article on The Good Source. I won't read it for you tonight because we're going to let him speak for himself. He was unable to join us tonight, but spoke to me earlier to tell me all about that article. So please welcome to Pellowe Talk, George Christensen, member for Dawson, the seat of Dawson. Talk, George Christensen, thanks for taking the time to expand a little bit further for the Pellowe Talk live audience.
Thanks, David. Pleasure to be on your show again.
Now, something I'm particularly passionate about is empowering authentic conservatives, authentic Christians to actually participate in party politics. Certainly anybody who wants to participate in the other parties should do, but I think one of the best chances we've got of regular mums and dads and people with a full-time wage outside of the call to politics making a difference in the future of our nation is being involved in party politics, participating and helping pre-select better members. In one hand, what you've spoken about on Facebook this week and has been reported widely in the media has both confirmed and turned that on its head. You've basically said that the party machine is a law unto itself, which I think means all the more reason to make sure we're in there helping to pre-select good people of conscience and conviction who won't be taken captive by the status quo or the trends and whims of society. But at the same time, so much of the rest of party life, branch meetings and the state conference, actually seem to be, at the moment, almost a waste of time.
Well, you've probably hit the nail on the head with that last statement. Look, for the purposes of your listeners and your show, David, I guess that the most critical thing that I could talk about is the President's Committee and how it has actively gone out of its way to stop conservative and Christian people from joining the party. And some of these people that I'm talking about. I mean, Lyle Shelton was one of them. We've lost Lyle Shelton to the Christian Democrats. He is now a New South Wales upper house member. The person who headed up the Australian Christian lobby, barred from entering the LNP. He is but the tip of the iceberg. I've had person after person after person who is conservative or Christian come to me and tell me that the big wigs and the President's Committee have barred them from entering the party. It is just plain wrong. And this is endemic because I also know of a pro-life activist, a very well-known pro-life activist. I'm not going to name her, but she was trying to be, she's a party member already. I'm not sure whether she still is a party member. I wouldn't blame her if she's not, because she wanted to run for a pre-selection for a state seat. And she was told by the party bosses that they couldn't possibly allow her to run for pre-selection because she was too pro-life, and that's not the direction they wanted to go in. Well, a newsflash to these faceless men and women, the overwhelming majority of the LNP rank and file is conservative, Christian, and pro-life. These people shouldn't be blocked from coming into the party. They should be embraced with open arms that they're wanting to come in and contribute to the political discourse in this country and try and make what should be the main Conservative Party even stronger.
Yeah, certainly one of the fears that these party controllers have is the fear that an influx of authentic Christians and authentic conservatives is going to make their own compromised positions somewhat untenable democratically. And so they have to stop that influx of members and label that undemocratic, when all people like me, who I'm not a party member because I know of the short leash that the LNP likes to keep party members on. I want to be able to call a spade, balls and strikes. And to me, it's undemocratic and totalitarian to exclude people from the party because they're too conservative, too Christian. And the reality is that the agenda that people like me want to join with is to make the party better, to help defeat Labor. If there's 3 or 4 right of centre candidates, we want to choose the one who best represents us long before we get to the ballot box in a general election. But party elders seem to think that that is undemocratic, and they call it branch stacking, and then invent punitive measures to stop it from happening and preserve the status quo.
Correct, but it's worse than that. I was part of a push to get people who had probably felt a bit disgruntled with the Liberal Party or the National Party or the LNP to come back to the party, to come back home. So we went out chasing people who, may have flirted with One Nation or with Australian Conservatives or, what have you, and said to them, look, come back home, come into the party. We need you here. We need your sensible views to help us regain government. And so we had a flood of these people coming into the party, and the party bosses were rubbing their hands with glee. Cha-ching, cha-ching, every time a membership fee was paid. And what they were thinking was, wow, a lot of these are coming from Brisbane, and we're going to have more people to go out and man the booth. So they're happy for these people to come in, pay the fees, do the donations, do the fundraising drives, do all the grunt work, go out door knocking, stand in the hot sun for market stalls or polling booth or pre-poll or what have you. But then you know what happened? These people who joined started saying, well, maybe we might want to actually take up a position in the party. And then one of them was elected to a Brisbane branch, the head of a branch. And suddenly everyone started lighting their hair on fire. Who are these people? Who are all these people that joined up? What are we going to do? The next minute, you have the executive pushing for new measures that restricted members' voting rights and also restricted people's eligibility within the party to stand for office. So now you have to be a member of the party for 12 months before you can actually hold office in the party, or before you can vote in a pre-selection or even on a motion or a position like an office bearer position in a branch. That's something that's never been the case. They're going to tell you it makes it all the more difficult to get people into the party. And we said that at the time. People who want to come in, they want to come in guns are blazing because they're full of energy. Well, you tell them sit in the corner and be cannon fodder for a year. they're not going to be so excited. They're probably not even going to join up.
Yeah. No, the reason people join is to have a say, get involved, and not just be cheap labour. And yeah, if they're not being heard, if they're not feeling part of that process, I've got to say, part of my push, part of the reason I've been doing what I've been doing for so many years is to get Christians out of the pews and into the parties, so they actually can love their neighbour better. It's not about threatening any particular personality. What I do want to threaten is the march through the institutions, the creeping wokeism where people like Malcolm Turnbull, who was the first Prime Minister to campaign against Australia's extant marriage laws. I mean, that's just atrocious that should come from the right side of politics. And yet it seems like the broad tent, which John Howard coined that phrase of, now wants to exclude classical liberals and conservatives and only embrace those self-congratulatorily named self-titled moderates, as if there's anything moderate about them, when they're only marginally less left than Labor. But it's a real disincentive to the people that I'm trying to appeal to and say, hey, make politics better, get involved, and they're actually punished for being conservative.
Well, let me allay some fears, right? So the bizarre thing is that I know some of these people who are the, call them faceless men and women, the party bigwigs, party bosses, what have you. And some of them are very conservative themselves. Some of them are very Christian themselves. So you think, well, why would they be excluding people wanting to join the party, people wanting to run? And what, I've tried to work it out. I really have tried to work it out. And the best that I can come up with is what I said in my Facebook post. I think that they have just become so ingrained in being in control of the party that now anything that looks like a threat is going to be treated like a threat, and anything, what threats are to them is anyone that may subscribe to some higher cause than just simply the dictates that they issue from their high office. Yeah. So, it may not necessarily be a moderates versus conservative sort of battle that's going on here. Although I think that some of that has crept in. Some of it definitely has crept in.
Oh, for sure.
People in the so-called moderate force within the LNP have probably been rubbing their hands together. The fact that these Christians and conservatives have been excluded. But look, the problem is much
I know for an absolute fact, George, that the left factions of the LNP have been rubbing their hands together in glee at perceived short-term victories and triumphs over who they coin and phrase and position as the others. I think the Courier Mail has labelled them the Christian soldiers. In their minds, it's an us versus them battle, instead of all of us together in this alleged broad church against the Labor Party.
Well, there's more than just that, though. I mean, that's the big one. That's probably one that's most relevant to you. But I can tell you perhaps the most disenfranchised group within the party, or the ones that feel the most disenfranchised, are the regional and rural members who, put up their views time and again, tell head office, tell the bigwigs what they want to see in terms of policies, what they want to see in terms of campaigning, and they're just overlooked. It's just like, okay, go back into your corner. We're going to do it our way. I mean, at the last state election, let me just give you an example of that. At the last state election, I was asked to look over a brochure that was going to be put out for one of the state candidates. And I had a look at this brochure, and it had in there the pledge that the LNP were going to do an upgrade of the M1. And I'm thinking, what the hell's that got to do with North Queensland? But yet this is the kind of thing they're wanting to send out. So it's little things like that to big things like saying, no, we can't have a coal-fired power station up here. We really do need to listen more to the people from the regions, because the resultant impact is the LNP now has 2 seats north of Mackay. 2 seats. The Qatar Australia Party has 3.
Wow.
So, go figure.
Yep. It definitely says there's a constituency not being serviced by the LNP there in regional Australia. Look, I think I actually think it's fair to play by the rules, and the democratization of the party is a much needed reform where power gets returned to the base, returned to the grassroots, and there's just be a whole lot more of buy-in. I like the old model of the National Party, where the state conference, resolutions and policy conclusions were binding on the parliamentary wing of the party, which has fallen by the wayside. And any policies debated and decided upon by the conference are of absolutely no significance or consequence to the policies officially of the party in opposition or government.
Look, I'll believe that there's reform when I see it. The people who are entrenched and ensconced in the upper echelons of the party, the hierarchy as we call it, they will fight tooth and nail to stop any meaningful change. I put it in my Facebook post, but I want to underline this one. I was there present, and I would swear on a stack of Bibles on this that this happened. I was there at a state council meeting, it's a very powerful body within the LNP where decisions of the President's Committee and state executive are supposed to be ratified. They're pretty much just rubber stamped. But there was one controversial agenda item, and I forget what it was, but we had a vote, and it was quite clear to me and to many others that the vote was defeated. I think it was defeated, and the chairman ruled that the vote was in favour, and then declared there was an afternoon tea break, and then everyone dispersed very quickly. And I was like, I looked at the person next to me and I said, "That's rubbish. That was against." And they said, "Yeah, it was too. Nothing can happen now."
Wow.
So they're the kind of tactics that you see from the head office just to get their way, and it's just wrong. Basic democracy.
I think you and I are probably on the same page, and when I say all we really want is there to be a level playing ground, stop stacking the deck and let it just be grassroots, democratic. David Crisafulli, these are his sentiments that you're echoing in your Facebook post. Return power to the grassroots and get rid of the President's Committee. What do you think is David Crisafulli's future? Has he criticised the hand that's feeding him? Is his days now numbered, or do you think he stands a chance of success?
Well, I think what you have is David Crisafulli plus the grassroots all in sync on this, and that's them against the hierarchy. So it'll be interesting who wins that battle. I suspect, though, that what will happen is what the Courier Mail has reported, and that is that the olive branch will be, we'll let the leader of the party and the deputy leader plus, someone else or a few other people join the President's Committee to help democratise it. Well, you could say, well, okay, that's putting a few guardians on the President's Committee, but in essence, all it is making the leader and deputy leader and all the others they put on it complicit in the dictatorial decisions that committee is still going to make. that committee has too much power. That committee has the ability to do whatever they want and make the party do whatever they want. Kick someone out, suspend someone. It happens effectively immediately. Yes, you've got appeal rights. You can go to other tribunals and units within the party to try and appeal it, but it's never ever done because they've got all the processes, they've got all the control, and that's what effectively the President's Committee is. It sees itself, without a doubt, as the LNP, and it sees everyone else underneath it as electoral cannon fodder. You are the grunts. You go out and do the work. We make the decisions. We've got the big boys' pants on. Well, that ain't how a Democratic Party should operate.
No, it sounds like they've got all the power and enjoy and intend to maintain the power of judge, jury, and executioner over every policy and decision and members' fate and fortune in the party.
It's very sad indeed. It needs to be fixed, and that's what my call is. It's not, it does pain me to say it, actually, because I've been a member of the party for almost 3 decades now. It pains me to say it, but it's truth, and sometimes the truth, even a hard truth, an uncomfortable truth, needs to be told to get a fix. I hope that there is a fix. I hope we see progress at this state council, but I got to tell you, I won't be holding my breath on it.
No, indeed. Well, we'll be sure to do a follow-up report on this in next week's episode. So that is the LNP State Conference or Convention. I can't remember which word they prefer, but that's happening, convention, tomorrow in Brisbane. George, thank you very much for making yourself available for the Good Source audience, as always.
Thanks very much, David.
Well, that's on tomorrow, starting tomorrow in Brisbane, the LNP convention. It's also extending through Saturday and Sunday. And at that convention, there hopefully will be a showdown or an easy passing of major reforms. I don't think the hegemony, the existing powers, controllers, and bigwigs, as George put it, of the LNP will surrender that power quickly. However, that is something that's going to be there. So I encourage all members to get along to the convention if you can, and let us know. I certainly won't be going, but I'll be very interested in hearing the on-the-ground reports of what goes on, and if there's a free and fair debate, if there's genuine reform, if the President's Committee gets abolished, or if it just gets a little gesture to pretend it's going to look democratic by including the parliamentary leader, which, as George said, really isn't a worthwhile change at all. Yes, the major parties have had democracy in them in the past. This isn't a corrupt and hopeless entity and solution. It's just drifted, and they need some conventions to restore back to what they once were. As I said, with George, the National Party used to have binding sentiments on the parliamentary wing, that what the members wanted actually became policy, and that's the way it should be. A guest joining us soon, Professor David Flint, has some great ideas on reintroducing democracy back into the major parties, and those things are very good. But what we don't want is a small group of people wielding dictatorial power over an organization that is meant to be representative of its members. And this is just the mood for the decade, 2020, 2021. It seems like those in power are greedily, voraciously accumulating more and more power for themselves. And alarmingly, citizens of free nations are handing over power willingly, enthusiastically, pleading on their knees, please, government, save us, please, government, save us from a virus that has a 99.7% mild rate, incredibly hard to die from. Please, what's actually killing us is government. What's actually destroying our nation is a pandemic of government power, not a Wuhan flu. And I had somebody on social media object to me using that term, saying they were very concerned that I used that slang term. Well, the Russian Communist Party was very concerned that people thought that their incompetence and arrogance led to the explosion of the Chernobyl nuclear power plant. This is the fact that the Chinese Communist Party simply wants to cover up their responsibility for the poor management, ignorance, and arrogance of their communist regime at the Wuhan Institute of Virology. They actually put the name on the door. It's right there over the door. The Wuhan Institute of Virology. This is the Wuhan flu. Just like German measles, just like the Spanish flu, it's geographically accurate. And what I'm concerned about is that we have well-intended people in Australia supporting communist propaganda. And that's not something we should be part of. But the constant assault on freedoms in our nation is something that we absolutely must say enough is enough. That we can't have any more of this at all. We've got it's so easy to talk about the financial cost, about the business cost, about the economic cost, but that is just the tip of the iceberg that you can see above the water. What's buried beneath the water, what's very hard to measure, is the health cost, the fatalities from directly consequential to government policy, not the flu, government policy. The lockdown, the delayed detection of degenerative and infectious diseases, cancer, diabetes, heart disease, other diseases which, if detected early, are treatable and not life-threatening, but if detected late, will cost lives in the coming years. There's been plenty of documentation and writing about the health cost, the mortality cost, the life years lost because of government policy, not the Wuhan flu. Not to mention all the people plunged into depths of depression, anxiety, stress, isolation, loneliness, epidemic psychological disease resulting in suicides now at incredible rates, rumored increases in domestic violence, and the stresses on people's lives and marriages, being separated from loved ones as important life events, births, weddings, funerals, the ridiculous, punitive, inconsistent and arbitrary laws. And we've got citizens and media begging the government to take our freedoms away from us. Well, enough is enough. This Saturday, there is a worldwide demonstration, a worldwide protest for a day of freedom. And freedom is exactly what this is all about. It's not about my selfish preference for comfort and not wearing a mask. The critics of us, freedom lovers, say, I'm happy to wear a mask if it's going to save just one life, as if we're killing people by refusing to wear a mask, which is obnoxiously rude and presumptuous of our motives. What I'm actually motivated by is freedom for my neighbors, not just my comfort wearing a mask, not just my personal liberty, but the liberty and freedom for my 25 million neighbors. You know what the difference is we are so drunk and stupefied on the abundant freedom that we've had for so long, we have no capacity or context for actually valuing it by comparison to the lack of freedom. Well, let's look at the lack of freedom and what that does to a nation. This is a picture of the Korean Peninsula. The Korean Peninsula by night from a NASA satellite. And in that picture, you can see the southern tip of the peninsula, South Korea, and the northern tip of the peninsula, North Korea. The capital of the north is Pyongyang, and that is the only flickering light of any strength in the darkness of night from space in the middle of the ocean. And then you have South Korea, which is just bursting with light. Its capital exploding with intense light that you can't even see the darkness between the different suburbs. And all over the nation, there's just burgeoning industry and development. In the north, they like to call that food. But in the south of Korea, you've got not just industry and economy, but you've got religious freedom, you've got spiritual freedom, you've got freedom to preach the gospel, you've got freedom to disagree with the government and be an atheist. You can do whatever you want within civil reason in South Korea. And the difference isn't the Wuhan flu. The difference is a pandemic called government tyranny. The difference is freedom. And that's what we need to fight for. This is far more important to the future of Australia than a silly inconvenience from masks. That is not what we're concerned about. And if you're a critic or if you're a critic of people complaining about the government tyranny now, you need to know it's not something so petty. And if you are focusing on people who have those kind of cheap complaints, you're really doing yourself a disservice by not trying to answer the best arguments against this current expanse of power. So I want to encourage you further to head to a protest that's going to be near you this Saturday. This Saturday, there's going to be 180 plus cities around the world. One day, everyone together, we will all be there. This website is worldwidedemonstration.com, worldwidedemonstration.com. And on it, you will find a link to organizations. And there you will find a link to at least 4 different rallies happening in Australia. Melbourne, Adelaide, Perth, and Brisbane is the bottom one there, the People's Revolution. I've been speaking to some of the organisers in Brisbane or people involved with the organisation there, maybe not the only ones. But that's going to be really good. So just in brief, the worldwide demonstration, also known as, or more commonly known, I've only seen it called the Worldwide Rally for Freedom, is an internationally syndicated community protest event dedicated to emboldening citizens to push back against coronavirus-related restrictions in their countries. The event is deployed by member organizations in each city with full local autonomy at the grassroots level. It's completely decentralized, using international consensus to align the date, and leaving all local organization local. And of course, it's completely peaceful and it's not apolitical. That is a terrible use of the word, common and terrible. It's non-partisan. That's what they mean there. It's not affiliated with any political party, but it's very, very political because the tyranny that we're protesting is political. And so the statement is, of course, political. Well, I also want to mention that there's probably going to be something encouraging for men in particular at the Brisbane event. So that was something the organisers requested I mentioned. Be great to see you there. I'll be at the Brisbane Botanic Gardens at midday on Saturday. And the protest should be fairly long there. There'll be a march which leaves in the middle and goes somewhere and comes back. So, bring a bottle of water and maybe a snack, because it'll probably start about midday and might finish somewhere between 3 and 4 p.m. And of course, you don't have to come for the whole lot. Now, can I please ask everybody, if you are going to the protests this Saturday, I would really love to get you to send me some videos, short clips, long clips, with notes on any particular time where something interesting happens. I'll try and put them all together and make a report on the protest around Australia. Please send those videos to editor@goodsource.news. You can, if it's small enough, you can send it as an attachment to the email or upload it to a cloud storage somewhere and just send me the link to download it. editor@goodsource.news. Well, before we started the show tonight, we actually read an article just in the pre-warm-up time from Professor David Flint. And I'm going to ask him to join us in just a second. But that's because there's been some armchair experts on the internet offering some very, very assertive opinions, very, very loud and strong in their opinions about the Constitution. And I'm concerned that these people who are essentially time wasters are being listened to by people with an open mind and intellectual curiosity. Now, if you're one of those people who's very, very closed-minded, is absolutely certain that nobody who disagrees with them could possibly be telling the truth or possibly know what they're talking about, just not interested. This session and this segment isn't for you. Do your best to listen, and if you have something civil and sincere to contribute, disagreement is welcome. But primarily, this session on the Constitution now is for people who are confused and who would like an expert, a qualified, experienced professional, not an armchair expert. And look, I'm the best of armchair experts, but the right attitude for an armchair expert is to collect information and to not be dogmatic about it. And to be fair, I've had to change my mind on what I thought the Constitution said over the last week or two, because the most honest and intellectual thing we can do is pursue truth and be open to correction. And so this is really, really important. And of course, this is to do with the topic of mandated medicines, mandatory vaccines. Yes, that big, ugly V word. Hopefully we don't get the video taken down. And if so, we'll keep streaming and it'll put it up on Rumble and the website tomorrow morning. But that is essentially what we're going to be talking about now. And one of the worst things that we can do is be like the radical left and interpret the Constitution through our preferred outcomes instead of what it actually says. So let's talk about the Constitution, legislation, and rights to interpretation. Because opinions are like belly buttons. Everybody got one, and some of them are fluffier than others. Professor David Flint, AM, is an emeritus professor of law and was chairman of the Australian Broadcasting Authority and the Australian Press Council. He was president of the National Federation of the English-Speaking Union, associate commissioner with the Australian Competition and Consumer Commission, and convener of the Committee of Australian Law Deans. He has been national convener of Australians for Constitutional Monarchy since the 1999 referendum campaign, and he has authored books on topics such as the media, international economic law, and on the Constitution. If you haven't written a book on the Constitution, perhaps 2 ears, 1 mouth. At Barcelona in 1991, he received a World Jurist Association Award as World Outstanding Legal Scholar. He was made a member of the Order of Australia in 1995. His Good Source show, Take Back Your Country, discusses the problems and solutions to the decay of federalism and democracy. Professor Flint, thank you so much for making yourself available tonight to help unravel some of the mysteries of what the Constitution says, how we should interpret it, and whose opinion really matters.
Well, good evening, David, and thank you for inviting me. The Constitution, as we know, is the document which united the country. I think the really important thing which we must all bear in mind is that under the Constitution, the American solution was adopted of having a high court, in America, a Supreme Court, and giving it the final authority, not expressly in America, but the court took it anyway. But that court has the final authority in telling us what the Constitution means. Let me say, I quite often have not been very happy with what the High Court has decided is the meaning of the Constitution. That said, all I can say is I disagree with that decision, but the only place we can go to for a binding decision on what the High Court, what the Constitution means, is the High Court. It tends to be the case, and this is a big criticism of America, tends to be the case that the Constitution means what the judges say it means. And there have been changes in the meaning over the years. And that's the situation we find ourselves in relation to this question as to whether compulsory vaccination can occur in relation to specific occupations, or even, and I think this would be terrible, but even in relation to all the population. There's even talk, as you know, of some form of vaccination passport, which you could use, or you need to use, in relation to crossing borders or in relation to going into certain places and so on. And the question is, to what extent can this be done? I think it would be wrong to do that. It would be in breach of a very fundamental principle.
Yes.
That medical treatment, including vaccination, requires informed consent. I think there's an obligation on the state to inform us properly, which they're not doing, in relation both as to the vaccine and the unintended consequences of the vaccine, but also in relation to the effectiveness of the vaccine, which I think is being over-preached by some of the authorities when you see what's happened in Israel and in the United Kingdom. That said, the Constitution, from the interpretation of the High Court, is quite clear in relation to both the role of the Commonwealth and of the states.
Now, something that let's start at the beginning. Let's actually get to the meat of the conspiracy theories that are going out there, the constitutional conspiracies. Section 51 and Section 52 of the Constitution, what is their purpose and what do they exist for?
Well, Section 51 sets out the legislative powers of the Commonwealth. And all of those in 51, which is the biggest list of powers, are those which the Commonwealth Parliament can exercise, or the executive can exercise under legislation. But they are all shared with the states. None of them are exclusive. The exclusive powers are in Section 52, and there aren't many ones exclusive to the Commonwealth. So most powers are shared with the states. And to overcome the problem that there could be a contradiction between federal and state laws, you find in Section 109 a very simple provision. It merely says that if there is an inconsistency between a law passed by the federal parliament and a law of the states, then the law passed by the federal parliament must prevail. And the High Court's developed a doctrine, which is that if you can establish that the Commonwealth, that Canberra intends to take over the whole power, occupy the whole field, then the High Court will give all of the power to the Commonwealth. So there are a number of powers, they're all shared, and among these are powers relating to medical matters.
Mm-hmm. So there is no... I'll make statements and you contradict them. If I'm wrong, tell me I'm wrong. Viewers watching, your questions and your comments are most certainly welcome. If you're not interested in listening at all, then just don't bother. But I think most of the 99.7% of Pellowe Talk watchers are as harmless and as the coronavirus. Only 0.3% are fatal. But look, if you've seen things out there, we'd love to clear them up tonight with a constitutional law professor. So Section 51, I think it's Section 23, Part A, Part 23A, says a part of the law of the areas where the federal government can share power with the state governments is excluding the particular words of private conscription, referring to medical and dental treatment. So what that says, correct me if I'm true or false, does that mean the federal government may not make any laws conscripting medical or dental treatment?
That's the interpretation of that provision. It was an amendment to the Constitution. It wasn't in the original Constitution. The amendment proved, one of the few proved by the people in the 40s. And it includes, as you say, medical and dental services, but not so as to authorize any form of civil conscription. Well, that
Civil
means,
conscription, that's the word.
yes, that means that at the state level, they may make laws in relation to medical and dental services, but they're not restricted
Right.
in relation to civil conscription. That restriction only applies to when the Commonwealth exercises that power. There was an understanding, an interpretation by the original High Court. The original High Court, headed by the Chief Justice, Sir Samuel Griffith, a former Premier of Queensland, they were unanimous in holding to the view that any power not listed among the powers in Section 51 were reserved to the states. In about 1920, the High Court changed that and gave a more centralist interpretation. They said, well, all of those powers in Section 51 don't need to be read on the understanding that a power that's not there is reserved to the states, like education. You give all of these powers their plain English interpretation to the full, and those are then Commonwealth powers. So by 1920, you see a change in the attitude of the High Court, increasing centralisation, which has continued to this very day. And we have a much more centralised federation than before. But what is clear in relation to the question you put to me is that if the Commonwealth exercises that power, it's subject to the rule that they can't set up a system of civil conscription,
Right.
but the states can.
Yes, the states can. Now, here...
And they have.
And they have, that's right. And of course, the states can pass bad laws that are objectively corrupt and frauds against natural law, and even unconstitutional laws, and they stand until challenged and overturned by the High Court. So that they exist already is not in and of itself proof that it's constitutional, but it certainly does mean that the High Court has not yet interpreted the Constitution against them. So here's the next bit.
Before you go on,
Yes.
the cases where the High Court has said a state law is not valid, particularly related to Section 92. That's trade, commerce and intercourse between the states shall be absolutely free. And they've used that quite a lot in the past, not so much now. But it's always open to the High Court to say such and such a law breaches the Constitution, but they don't often do it.
No. And the High Court, I think you've taught me this, tends to consistently rule on the side of the Commonwealth, rightly or wrongly. Their opinion is the one that tends to matter. Now, Section 109 says that a law of the state has to be consistent with the law of the Commonwealth. And if there's an inconsistency, the Commonwealth law prevails. Is Section 51 a law about banning medical? Is it a law in itself, Professor Flint? Is Section 51 a law in itself which the states have to be consistent with?
It's not in the contemplation of Section 109. Section 109 is talking about the situation where you have, on the one hand, an act of the Commonwealth Parliament, not the Constitution, an act of the Commonwealth Parliament, and you have an act of the states, and where there's found to be an inconsistency. To the extent of the inconsistency, the state law is invalid and the Commonwealth law prevails. It's quite clear, but it only relates to an act of the Commonwealth Parliament and an act of the state parliament. It doesn't relate to the Constitution itself. The Constitution itself prevails anyway.
Now, Something I was bouncing off you earlier today, because I like to do my research, and there's at least half a dozen constitutional law professors I know. So when I pretend like I know something about this, it's because I'm researching it, and I get that the armchair experts are researching it. So that's in and of itself by the by, I guess. But I was speaking to Professor Augusto Zimmermann today, and when I was talking to you, Professor Flint, you corrected me that I was using the words reserve, as in the Constitution reserves some powers to the states, and that's not actually true, and I appreciate that correction. Professor Zimmermann said that he and Nicholas Aroni, who you may know, actually use language from Section 107. Now, let's just bring that up. And not that the Constitution reserves certain powers to the states and denies them to the Commonwealth, but let's just read Section 107. Every power of Section 107 is called saving of power of state parliaments. And it reads, every power of the parliament of a colony which has become or becomes a state shall, unless it is by this constitution exclusively vested in the parliament of the Commonwealth or withdrawn from the parliament of the state, continue as at the establishment of the Commonwealth, or as at the admission or establishment of the state, as the case may be. So it's saying there that the powers which the states have prior to federation and at the time of federation, those powers are not extinguished by the Constitution. They are to continue as specifically instructed by Section 107. And so if the Constitution doesn't take those powers away from the states, and the Commonwealth doesn't seek to overrule them there, as you explained earlier, then the default position is that the states do in fact have those those powers protected by Section 107, the continuance that those powers they had continue. Your thoughts on Augusto's commentary offered there?
Well, I can't deny Section 107. There's no doubt that applies. But if the High Court decides to give greater projections of the powers under Section 51, for example, take the external affairs power. What the High Court has effectively said is that if Canberra enters into a treaty, which is very easy to do, doesn't require going to Parliament, once Canberra enters into a treaty, for example, about environmental law, there's an international treaty on the environment, that then gives Canberra a power to legislate in relation to the treaty. So it vastly increases the legislative power of the Commonwealth. Now, I don't think the founders intended that, but that's what has happened.
That could, with that interpretation, give the Commonwealth rather ridiculous, trivial powers that really should be none of its portfolio. Would that be true?
That would be so. Take, for example, at the time of Federation, the states had vast powers in relation to criminal law, including criminal law penalties. Those penalties extended to capital punishment. A Commonwealth government entered into a United Nations treaty. Not all countries have entered into this. Which is a treaty for the abolition of the death penalty. The Commonwealth then passed a law abolishing the death penalty throughout the Commonwealth. That means, according to the High Court, no state can, even if it wants to, impose a death penalty against, say, a notorious murderer, a terrible traitor. That could not be imposed by the states because of this law that the Commonwealth has passed under the external affairs power, because it entered into a United Nations treaty about the abolition of the death penalty. Even though Section 107 says that the powers of the state in relation to criminal law continue after federation.
Well, yes, that is until they're withdrawn or exclusively vested. So some of those interpretations would be harmonious with Section 107. They're obviously not in perpetuity, but until otherwise rescinded is essentially my reading of it. Now, we have a question from Timothy Armstrong, just finding that, from earlier tonight. And he says, I think it's clear that the federal government is constitutionally barred from legislating to mandate vaccines. Correct me here if I'm wrong. You're not wrong. What, if anything, bars the states from mandating vaccinations, Professor Flint? What, if anything, bars the states from mandating vaccinations, given, for example, here in Victoria, there are already laws entering this area, that is, no jab, no play rules for children?
I would think that if the Commonwealth were determined to try this, to try and impose its own federal mandating law requiring vaccinations, they'd say, well, we're relying not on 23A, we're relying on the quarantine law. It's incidental to the quarantine power, which is in Placetum 9. That's what lawyers do. But let's say the Commonwealth decides not to do that. The states decide to do it. There is no obvious reason why the states can be restrained from that except under a state constitution. I can't think of a federal reason which would stop the states from imposing a requirement as to vaccinations, as they have already done. For example, on the first few days of the lockdown in New South Wales, when it was restricted to the eastern suburbs and the city. And remember, the lockdown was caused by a cluster which began, they called it the Bondi cluster. It began because the New South Wales government neglected advice for 4 months that they should regulate drivers of limousines who take around airline crews around Sydney. Well, they let that one go through, but that night, the night of the vaccine being, the lockdown being introduced into the eastern suburbs, Brad Hazard signed an order, which has the effect of subordinate legislation. He signed an order which regulates the vaccination of limousine drivers in Sydney. Now, I haven't heard that challenged, and I would think that if it were, there would be difficulty in finding a ground to challenge that. I would think that the closure of the building industry would be more easy to challenge than that.
Yeah, I certainly think political expediency is the best weapon we have in fighting this tyranny. That is, to make it too hot for the politicians to continue with this plan. I think fighting in the courts is the strongest legal recourse we have, with a very uncertain outcome, if not doubtful, because of the tradition of the High Courts to side with the Commonwealth. I mean, even Clive Palmer in Western Australia was unsuccessful there, and that seemed to be a very cut and dry case for keeping borders open for commerce constitutionally, and that wasn't enough to persuade the High Court.
It may have been in Clive, if I may interrupt that, in Clive Palmer's case, the lawyers decided to challenge the legislation which empowered the West Australian government to close the borders. What they might have done was to have challenged that actual closure, which they didn't do. And the Chief Justice vaguely drew attention to that what they were being asked to do was to find that the law which gives that power to the West Australian government to close the borders if there were a medical reason to do so was invalid, rather than challenging the specific example as being not in accordance with that law. But they didn't do that.
Yep. Okay. I'm just going to play a brief clip from Scott Morrison today. We won't play all of it. I'll tell you, Matt, when we just need to cut that. But let's have a quick look at this clip, and hopefully we've got the audio coming through.
All Australians that want to jab would have their second dose. And once they are able to have that opportunity, would you support measures such as vaccine certificates to make sure that people could go to events at full capacity next year?
Well, these are all the things that we'll consider in those various step changes, step 2, step 3. We already have vaccine certificates. They already exist. And those vaccine certificates this month we expect to be in a form that can be dropped into Apple wallets, things of that nature. And later in the year, about October we estimate, we'll have a vaccination certificate that will be able to be used, internationally recognised.
Just on no jab, you said we don't mandate vaccines in this country, but you, I believe, were Social Services Minister when no jab, no play came in, which is about as close as you can get to mandating vaccines. So why wouldn't you take that approach? Just to follow up this question.
Well, I didn't say we wouldn't. I'd say
why not take up the French approach, where we've got a tiny minority protesting and millions of extra people now getting vaccines?
My record, as you've outlined it, is true. So I think you know where I think my record speaks to my disposition on these things, but they're not things that the Prime Minister or even the federal government decides. Ultimately, restrictions that are be placed on people moving about in their states can only be imposed by states. The Commonwealth government can't do that. Only the state governments
completely
can place
immoral
restrictions on people entering a venue,
completely
entering
immoral.
a place of work, things like this. There are also industrial relations issues.
Complete violation of natural law.
They can apply the public health orders that mandate vaccinations, like the Western Australia Premier has done in terms of quarantine-based workers. They have those powers. They can implement them. I can provide them with the tools that helps them to implement them, like the digital vaccine certificates and things of that nature, and they can employ them. That's why we've kept them well up to date with how those mechanisms and those systems are working.
Recently, and Andrew, I mentioned earlier...
Just pause it there. I think that's... I mean, this is just appalling, Professor Flint. We have the government here, the federal government and the state governments essentially conspiring to set us up for complete martial law, complete deprivation of basic civil liberties, which were not granted by government. They were granted by God. And if you don't believe in God, then believe in the way the American founders chose to describe it as self-evident, unalienable rights.
I agree with you entirely. Those rights are self-evident. They're granted by our Creator, and they're not granted by the politicians. He is obviously preparing to give the states the tools they will need to do this. And did you notice that the reporter, as so much of the mainstream media are doing, the reporter was egging him on. The reporters have become not people trying to hold governments accountable. They are acting in many ways as the agents of the government, telling people to do the right thing, wearing masks when they don't wear masks, and that reporter saying, well, why don't you do this? I think it is very bad, and it is contrary, as you say, to the natural law. This is not for governments to decide. And there is enormous abuse here, just with the QR codes. Graham Greenleaf, who is the Australian expert in computer law, says that there are enormous loopholes in relation to the QR codes, and that he suggested legislation which would plug those, and these can lead to both government abuse and identity theft. He's the expert. He's given that warning. He gave it in December last year, and that has been ignored by all governments of Australia. I think the governments are behaving very badly.
They are behaving very badly. Look, we could probably go into the problem a whole lot further, and the symptoms and the evidence and the outright. I mean, the rest of that clip, which if you'd like to see the rest of that clip, it's available on Senator Malcolm Roberts' Facebook page. I'll put the link to that in the show notes for tonight, because the mainstream media go on to basically talk about sending the army from house to house. I think this was on Sky. Sending the army house to house in Fairfield to mandatorily vaccinate everybody in those suburbs, at least in those suburbs. I mean, we've got atrocious tyranny on the verge here. And so for anybody who would disagree with me and say my only concern is for the comfort of not wearing a mask, I think you're bonkers, and you do yourself a disservice by being so intellectually lazy as to just insult somebody disagreeing with you instead of trying to understand that my motivation is at least as compassionate as yours, and probably nowhere near as ignorant, with no due respect. But enough talking about the problems, Professor Flint. You've got some great solutions, and we've talked about them in times past, but not recently on the Good Source and Pellowe Talk, about how to return power to the grassroots, how to return people, how to re-democratize. Why don't you bullet point some of those major elements in your plans and strategies on how we could actually fix democracy in Australia?
Well, let me go back to the 19th century and remind viewers that federation was not achieved by the politicians. The first constitutional convention, which met in 1891, produced the constitution, but when it went back to the state parliaments, the colonial parliaments, they bickered among one another. The result would have been we would never have become one country. We'd probably be like South America, several countries on one continent. There was a people's conference, people concerned with the movement for federation. It was held at Corowa in 1893. And one of the great founders of Australia is not well known, Sir John Quick, moved a motion. It became known subsequently as the Corowa Plan. His argument was that in future, when another convention were held, it'd be directly elected. The convention beforehand was appointed. This should be directly elected. And the crucial part of the Corowa Plan was that once it came to a draft constitution and consulted widely with the people and the parliaments, it would then go back and finalise the constitution, and then that would be put directly to the people of Australia in a series of referendums. And that's what occurred. The extraordinary thing is that once that process started, in 4 years and 2 referendums, most states had to have 2 referendums because of obstinacy on the part of the people of New South Wales. And there was a slow move in Western Australia for a referendum. In 4 years, with 2 referendums, then taking the Constitution to London, putting it, they had to go there by ships that took several months, remember? And there were no faxes and no computers and no internet. And they got it through the British Parliament, which was very supportive with some minor changes. All of that was done, and it was proclaimed by the Queen after the Western Australian results came in. The whole thing took 4 years. 4 years. In Sydney,
Wow.
we couldn't lay a tram track down George Street in 4 years. It took longer than that. We can't build dams in 4 years, but the people of Australia made a nation in 4 years. Now, that constitution hasn't been looked at as a totality by the people since that time, and that's a long time ago, well over 120 years. We've had a few referendums. Remember, only the Commonwealth Parliament can put up a referendum, and naturally most of those have been to give more power to the Commonwealth. The people said, no, we're happy with the states having those powers.
Mm.
What we need is a second Corowa Plan. What we need is for the people of Australia, through a convention, to go through a similar process of the people electing a convention, I would say, with no candidates standing who are chosen by the major political parties, as happened with the Republic Convention in 1998. Have each state elect a number equivalent to their representatives and senators, let a convention meet and let the convention go through the Constitution and make recommendations to the people in referendums. about changes. And I would suggest that there should be 5 big changes. I call them the 5 R's. We should firstly return to the Constitution. We've become the most centralized federation in the world. No other federation is as centralized. The Canadian Federation was supposed to be centralized. Ours was supposed to be state-based. It worked out the other way when it actually came to practice. No federation in the world allows the central government to collect 80% of all the taxes, then give back a lot of that to the states, but on conditions, telling them how to spend it. That's why we have this terrible mess in education. The Commonwealth's trying to run education. The states are trying to run it. They've both really left it to the neo-Marxists who are changing the syllabus, who are lowering standards, and who are abusing the children with all sorts of silly ideas about transgender fluidity and all sorts of foolish things. It is a complete mess. And that's one thing that's wrong with this Australia. We must return to the Constitution. We must reduce the powers and the taxes taken by Canberra. We should reform the political parties. That would be my 3rd R. The parties receive enormous amounts of money from the taxpayer. For each vote, they get a certain amount of money. They get other money to play around with. They get exemptions from the privacy laws and the electoral laws. They're in a very favourable position. In return for that, just answering what George Christensen was talking about, in return for that, they should be required to be open, transparent, and democratic. If they don't want to be open, transparent, and democratic, give up the money and give up the exemptions. They'd soon
completely agree.
Open, transparent, and democratic. I would hope that they would move to primaries, as in America, because with primaries, you can't control the pre-selection by controlling who gets into your party. It's just the representatives. It's just the people. You vote in a primary in accordance with which party you support. You're registered as a Republican supporter or a Democrat supporter. That's how Trump got in.
Interesting.
The Republican establishment didn't want Trump, but he got in because the supporters of the Republican Party wanted him.
The problem of all this, of course, Professor Flint, is that all of these proposed reformations and reforms that you're proposing directly jeopardize the careers and accumulated power of the people who would need to usher them in.
That's why there has to be an enormous fuss demanding a convention. We form new parties, for example. We try to get new people in. What happens? In the long run, some things improve, but we really have to change the institution and make it so that there's much more direct democracy. We have representative democracy. We need more direct democracy. And that comes to my final 2 R's. Citizen-initiated referenda. We must have those, and they must be binding, as in Switzerland, and we must have recall elections. In both of those cases, a petition of a certain number of electors would initiate a referendum. A petition of a certain number of electors would initiate a recall election. The people would have much more control. It would make the politicians controllable 24/7. They realize that if they moved against the people, that the people would react by initiating referenda. Every 3 months in Switzerland, there are federal referendums. If people petition for a federal referendum, there are some. People vote on them. Voting is not obligatory, but it ensures that the politicians know that the people are always there watching them and changing laws, changing interpretations, approving treaties. Treaties have to be approved of any significance by the people. In Switzerland, you need much more control by the people. That's the only way that we're going to fix this up. And the politicians will only allow a convention if the people kick up an enormous fuss about it. We do have a petition about it. which you've very kindly put on my program from time to time.
If you would like to find that petition for these changes that Professor Flint is talking about, go to goodsource.news, and you'll be able to find contributors, I think it's called, or shows at the top of the website, and you will find the shows linked to Professor Flint, and at the bottom of every single one of his articles is a link to that referendum. Something else that I'd like to plug while we're doing so is this Professor Flint's book. There's also a link on the Good Source website to getting this book. This will give you a whole lot more information about what he's talking about tonight. Give Us Back Our Country, How to Make the Politicians Truly Accountable on Every Day of Every Month of every year, which is really, really great. Now, I do believe in democracy. It's the worst form of government apart from all the others. And it's indeed... I think the best form of government we can have, short of removing humans entirely from the equation, which I do believe will happen with the second coming of Christ. And if you don't believe in that, well, there's 8 times as many prophecies about that as there were about his first coming, which is a fact of history. Just a little religious trivia for you by the side. So Professor Flint, I love these options of citizen-initiated referenda, as they do in Switzerland 4 times a year. Just fantastic. And of course, recall elections. We see that happening in California right now. And as much as it sounds like it could be really annoying for politicians, it's not successful very often, but it is a vehicle for the people to fire really, really bad politicians. And one of the times it was successful was in California, when the governor was recalled to the ballot box before his term was up, and he was kicked out of office, and Arnold Schwarzenegger was made the governor of California in his stead. And right now we have Gavin Newsom being recalled as the governor of California. And we have, can't remember his name right now. I'm terribly sorry. Larry Elder. Apologies, Mr. Elder, for forgetting your name. But Larry Elder, fantastic, strong Christian conservative black man is running. And hopefully, what a wonderful hope for California if he was able to be elected instead of Gavin Newsom. California might turn into a functional state once again. So, well, we have gone a little bit over time, but this is such a fraught topic, and there's a great deal of overconfident right-wing people coming up with all kinds of conspiracy fantasies and really doing us a discredit by peddling them as incontrovertible facts. But I appreciate you clearing this up for us tonight, that the Constitution, in fact, does not prohibit the states from making laws to mandate medicines. We are going to have to fight this politically with the peaceful, lawful means gathered to us, and certainly the protest this Saturday worldwide against all kinds of oppressive coronavirus restrictions is something to be a part of. If you're going to be in Brisbane, I will be at the Brisbane protest at 12 p.m. in the Botanic Gardens, and the details of the other protests around Australia, as well as that one, links to the various grassroots organisations in each city, are at the website worldwidedemonstration.com. Let me tell you, this is the best way that I can think of getting an end to this tyranny the soonest. Battling this through the courts is unlikely to be successful, certainly won't be quick or cheap. Any further thoughts, Professor Flint? Any thoughts you weren't able to get out before I interrupted you?
Well, I do think we have to resist this. And this means demonstrating and so on. We mustn't allow the politicians to abuse their powers. This would be unjustifiable completely. And I do think if people agree that the way to proceed is to try and change our representative democracy, which has been captured by the major political parties, cabals of power brokers who control the pre-selections. They've changed what the political parties originally were. What we have to do is to try and include an ingredient of direct democracy, as you find in California in relation to the recall elections, particularly as you find in Switzerland, where there are state, local, and federal referendums possible every 3 months if people petition for them. So I think that direct democracy offers us a way in which we could do this, but it means we've got to force the hands of the politicians by an enormous demand for change.
Yeah, look, I mean it when I say democracy is the worst system of government apart from all the others, as in not to be entirely sarcastic. I mean, there are some really big problems with democracy. Right now, euthanasia is popular. And abortion does very well in the polls. You know, you can get some really corrupt, perverted laws in through the guise of popularity. In 18th century England, I have no doubt that slavery was a very, very popular legal policy in that nation at that time. The trade and commodification of people, just appalling things that can happen in democracy. But I do think some measures of direct democracy reforms that you suggest, Professor Flint, are probably the best way to balance the excesses and abuses of power and politicians that we are seeing. So incredibly rapidly accumulating and hoarding power for themselves, and to the extent of, you know, just who would have thought in the last decade that all our freedoms would be so grossly transgressed in this decade. If this is progress, I don't want a bar of it.
And so fragile.
Indeed. Well, thank you very much, Professor Flint. It's been a great pleasure to pick your brain and have your wise experience and qualifications guiding us in our understanding of the Constitution and what solutions may be available to us to repair democracy this evening. Thank you.
Thank you.
Well, that's it for this episode of the Pellowe Talk show. The Pellowe Talk show, we normally just call it Pellowe Talk. If you would like to become a supporter, please head to goodsource.news and click on the button to support or donate. We also look forward to having you subscribe to our newsletters there, where we can stay in touch. We're on Telegram, YouTube, Instagram, and all of the other social media channels. YouTube, Telegram, Twitter was one I forgot to mention. We look forward to sending you newsletters and appreciate the Good Source supporters who chip in generously every single month to contribute to the ongoing work that we do here. Very much appreciated. Thank you very much. And one more time, if you can at all make it to the Worldwide Day of Freedom this Saturday, I'd love to see you there.
Today, we need a special kind of courage. Not the kind needed in battle, but a kind which makes us stand up for everything that we know is right, everything that is true and honest. We need the kind of courage that can withstand the subtle corruption of the cynics, so that we can show the world that we are not afraid of the future.